Good afternoon, Tritons, and welcome to this year's Triton Leaders Conference for Allyship. On behalf of UC San Diego alumni and all of UC San Diego, I'd like to thank you for attending and engaging in the topics to be presented throughout the coming days. There are many definitions of allyship. As you go through the conference, you will learn how allyship is defined and how to be an ally. Today, we kick off the conference with keynote speakers, alumna Peace Uche and Tim Wise. Peace Uche is a doctor of pharmacy and a transformational rhythmic speaker and empowerment guru. Tim Wise is an anti-racist writer, educator, and an acclaimed commentator on racial issues. But before getting to our keynotes, I'd like to present our UC San Diego Chancellor, Pradeep K. Khosla, with some opening words.
Hello, I'm Pradeep Khosla, Chancellor of UC San Diego, and thank you for joining us for the 2022 Triton Leaders Conference. For 5 years now, this conference has brought together Triton leaders to learn about campus priorities, to share diverse experiences, and to empower attendees. This year's theme is Allyship, Achieving Inclusive Excellence. One of UC San Diego's strategic goals is to cultivate a diverse, equitable, and inclusive university community. We build and maintain that community by encouraging respectful, open dialogue, just like we are doing today. While the past 2 years have tested our Triton fortitude, our entire community has come together to face the pandemic, violence, and political division. Throughout these challenges, we have examined our values, confronted our biases, and reaffirmed our commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. We have rededicated ourselves to working together to find equitable solutions to the toughest issues of our time. This year, we take heart that several Triton alumni were appointed to change-making roles at top levels of our government. President Biden appointed Alondra Nelson as Deputy Director for Science and Society in the Office of the Science and Technology Policy. Stephanie Akpa is now Senior Advisor for the Office of Civil Rights in Washington. Cindy Martin is the Deputy Secretary of U.S. Department of Education. And Melody Gonzalez now leads a White House initiative to advance Hispanic educational equity, excellence, and economic opportunity. While other Tritons are making a difference at this level, there are countless alumni driving change in their neighborhoods and regional communities. We are all here because we are committed to creating a more inclusive and equitable human experience. I hope that you will continue to advocate within your own spheres of influence, and I hope that you will continue to inspire further change in yourselves and others. Thank you all for coming. Let's get going here.
Thank you to Chancellor Khosla for setting the tone for the day. I am now pleased to introduce Dr. Peace Uche, who will announce the university's True Triton Honorees for 2022, along with the recipients of the Outstanding Regional Alumni Club Award, and then provide us with some words of inspiration.
And now to announce our honorees. This year's True Triton awardees are Diana Falk Rai, class of 2001 and 2004, Humna Khan, class of 2018, Brian Knox, class of 1996 and 2007, Edward Spriggs, Jr., class of 1970, Luis, yes. Shall I restart? Greetings, everyone. And now to announce our honorees. This year's True Triton awardees are Diana Falk Rai, class of 2001 and 2004, Humna Khan, class of 2018, Brian Knox, class of 1996 and 2007, Edward Spriggs Jr., class of 1970, Luis Yu, class of 1993 and 1995. And the Outstanding Regional Club of the Year award goes to Los Angeles Regional Club. Congratulations to you all. Thank you for shining your light bright. I'd now like to invite us all to take a collective breath as we shift into what Triton Leaders Conference is all about: kindness, justice, inclusion, and embracing diversity. In and out. In a world where technology strives to connect us, it seems as if we still find a way to disconnect emotionally. We may sense internal warnings, but we seldom heed them. Battery low. Battery low. Battery low. We smile, but our smile doesn't reach our eyes because we're disconnected. We may not wear a frown, but there's pain in our eyes because we're disconnected. Our expressions don't reflect our true feelings. We perfected the art of grinning and bearing, and when asked how it goes, nobody wants to hear. It blows. So it's become the norm to respond in turn with a, hey, I'm good. And you? The faster the response, the more real it must seem. It's that second delay that may give it away that things aren't really A-okay. Get it? Get it connected. I remember when I was a child, learning how to ride a bike. Pedal to go, brake to stop. Must have forgotten to brake because when the next turn came, I biked straight to the bushes into a brick wall of shame. I looked around, no one in sight, so I picked myself up, dusted my pride off, and walked home with a slight limp on my right. But my lips were sealed tight. See, tight-lipped smiles are righteous indignation hidden between the cracks. As a child, I learned to cover up my scars. I didn't want to admit to defeat. Rather, I jumped to my feet, pretend that I never left my seat, that I never hit the ground. See, tears, they don't make a sound. It's the red eyes that give it away. So I'll smile the pain away because I'm disconnected. Get it? Get it connected. Back when I was a preteen, oh my, kids those days could be so mean. I owned my name Peace and wrote the sign next to every name line. But in my school, that wasn't cool. And the jokes ensued that I couldn't spell peace, that I couldn't say peace. See, back then I had a lisp, and the words I couldn't say were on a long list. So I put my head down and walked away. And when the teacher asked if I was okay, I'd smile the pain away because I'm disconnected. Get it? Get it connected. Now I'm all grown up. I see the hurt, the blank eyes, the tight-lipped smiles. They don't fool me. I'm the queen of deceit. See, I've learned over time it's not worth it to smile because it's all in the eyes. They'll eventually show what lies below, the pain left untold. And when the eyes tell the story, it may be too late to care because we forgot how. So I might as well share now that I was disconnected. And when I fell down, when I hit the ground, it wasn't old age that wore me out. It was running on fumes, afraid to plug in and recharge because sometimes it's easier to let the power run low instead of reload. Because who wants to admit we don't know where this road goes? We're just along for the ride. It's a pity we live so carefree. Disconnected is not what we're meant to be. Get it? Get it connected. Power on. Connected. And now that we are better connected with ourselves and each other, I invite everyone here to join me in this short exercise. I want you all, as you're sitting in your homes or in your offices, to hug yourself tightly and repeat after me. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful me. That's right. Let's say it again. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful me. One more time. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful me. How are we all feeling? You just completed higher invocation exercise to raise your inner vibration. These times that we're in are different times. And oftentimes you might find yourself questioning, like are you my friend? I'll admit, I'm confused. I used to friend request and now I follow. Am I in this alone? I once thought that birds flew solo, each bird on its own, just feathers and bone, relying alone on their wings to soar. Now I see that even though they move independently, they are part of something much greater than what they could be individually. And like a bird, I may sing to my own music and dance to my own drum, but connections ground me, reminding me that I am not alone. My purpose is greater than me, myself, or I. I once believed that whether or not I chose to use my gifts was my prerogative. But does bearing my talents do you or I any good? Pardon my mind delay. Sometimes I may need to remind my mind what it's capable of, jog myself from doubt to a confident state. See, I am not alone, my friend, and neither are you. I see you. We are in this flock together for the better, and together we thrive. Together we thrive. Together we thrive indeed. Thank you, Tritons, for being present. Thank you for shining your individual lights so bright so that we as a community can shine even brighter. I now like to pass the mic over to the incredible Tim Wise. I'm Doc Peace. Shine on.
Thank you so much. I assume that I'm on now. I'm not good with the tech. I'm sitting here fiddling with the technology, trying to make sure that I don't get disconnected. I am a 53-year-old man whose technological prowess ended around 1981 with Atari video games. So really, anything more recent than that, I am taking all kinds of risks here. So I'm going to assume everything will be fine. We've been doing this Zoom stuff now for a couple of years. You'd think we would have it pretty well down by now. But in any event, if I do get disconnected, it will not be y'all's fault. It'll be mine. I will probably have blown up the electrical grid here in my neighborhood in Nashville, Tennessee, and I will, I don't know, I'll try to figure out some other way to get reconnected to y'all. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you for this event, even if it is this virtual thing that we've been doing for a couple of years now. It's certainly better than nothing, an opportunity for us to connect around some very important issues, and particularly this theme of allyship. Now, obviously, as an anti-racism educator and activist, my principal way in which I engage that issue is around the issue of white allyship in the struggle against racism led by Black and brown peoples, both in this country and around the world. But the remarks that I have to share with you about allyship really apply to any kind of allyship. And every one of us has an opportunity to act as an ally in solidarity with some other individual or group of people, whether or not we're talking about the issue of race. So it could be men acting in solidarity with women, those of us who are straight or cisgendered acting in solidarity with LGBTQ folk, those of us who are, upper middle class acting in solidarity with working class and lower income and poor folk, those of us who are able-bodied acting in solidarity with those who are disabled. Whatever the case might be, we've got, any number of categories: religion, socioeconomics, culture, linguistic, all kinds of areas in which some groups are sort of the dominant group and other groups are subordinated groups. And it's important for when we are in the dominant part of that sort of binary or that dyad that we act in solidarity and allyship with those who are being marginalized. And so even though I tend to focus on race, my remarks are not just about race today. What I want to share with you are sort of 3 or 4 really important, I think, pieces of advice or ways to think about allyship, things that are important if you're trying to fight systemic injustice. And again, my remarks may focus in on race, but you can apply them to any other of these categories. First and foremost, I'll get the easiest one out of the way. I guess it's the easiest of them. It'll be up for you to decide that, I suppose. But the first is the idea that even though ally and even the term allyship are technically nouns, they function as verbs. And it's important for us to understand allyship as a verb or ally as a verb, not just as a noun. And ally is not what you are, it's what you do. Right. And so it's really easy for any of us, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd a couple of years ago, the largest racial justice uprising in American history, just in sheer numbers, took place in the summer of 2020. And a lot of people who had never been actively involved in that racial justice struggle before poured into the streets, got active on their campuses, got active in their workplaces and in their communities, and began to call themselves allies. And I think for the most part, the vast majority of the people who called themselves that were well-intended and had all of the best intentions and heart in terms of what they were trying to accomplish and what they meant when they called themselves that. But the problem is sometimes it's easier to label yourself an ally than it is to actually act in alliance and in solidarity, which is a longer term thing. It's not something you just put a label on or one of those "hello, my name is" stickers, at a conference or something, right? It's something that you have to do and do over and over and over again. One can proclaim themselves an ally, let's say, in the struggle against racism. You can proclaim yourself an ally in the struggle against Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or sexism, misogyny, rape culture, all of these things on a Monday. But then by Friday, if you're not still actively engaging that work and thinking about what it means for the next week and the next month, then that allyship becomes only a noun, right? It's not functioning as a verb anymore, which means that it's really not functioning at all. What it also means when I say that allyship is a verb is that it's something that you have to continue to try to recreate even when you fall down and make mistakes, which all allies will. I tend to refer to myself as an aspiring ally because I realize that even though I've been doing this work for over 30 years on a professional level, more than that, if you just go back to the sort of campus activism days, maybe 35 years of active engagement in the anti-racism community and anti-racist movement, I will still make mistakes. I make them weekly. Anyone who does this work for any length of time will. Now, someone who simply calls themselves an ally when they screw up might still say to themselves, well, it doesn't matter, I'm an ally, so yeah, I screwed up. But someone who understands allyship as a verb understands that that mistake is a learning experience that one has to own and acknowledge, especially if the mistake ends up being hurtful or distressing to those who you're trying to act in solidarity with. And then you have to figure out ways to move forward in spite of the mistake. I think sometimes if we understand it as a process, in other words, as opposed to this fixed thing in time, that we have a healthier attitude about our own relationship to the notion of solidarity. We understand that we are going to make mistakes, we are going to screw up, and we have to sort of pick ourselves up and do what big people do, which is you try again, right? So that's an important piece, allyship being a verb. It also allows us to remain humble, right? Because part of political activism or social activism or any kind of social justice work of any kind is it's very easy to lose humility in the midst of that, right? Especially if you call yourself an ally, right? To say, well, I'm an ally, I'm working on behalf of or with, in solidarity with, and then to forget that you might have only learned about this stuff, metaphorically speaking, last Wednesday. right? So if you just learn some stuff on Wednesday and now the next Monday comes and you're starting to get pissy with everybody that doesn't understand what you understand, which is what we do, right? We learn a little something about injustice. All of a sudden we become aware, we become enlightened about racism. We become enlightened about misogyny. We become enlightened about heterosexism, homophobia, transphobia, all these injustices. And then we get real pissy with the people that don't see what we see, but we didn't see it until last Wednesday. You understand? So if we start to judge other people for the stuff they don't know, then what we're really saying is that we should have been judged on the day before we learned it. And I don't think we would have probably appreciated that. So if we understand allyship as a process, right, not as a fixed thing, then it becomes easier to retain the humility that allows us to create more allies, right? To actually bring more people in. People, oddly enough, one thing that I've learned in that 30 years, don't generally join a struggle if they feel like they're only going to be judged and attacked once they come into it for not having joined it earlier, right? And we saw some of this in the wake of the racial justice uprising. A lot of folks who said, well, it's about damn time, where you been? Well, that's fine. Like, I understand that. I understand the frustration at people not having seen what some others had seen. I've been seeing it for a long time because I had mentors who helped me see it. But if my only thing to say to people is, well, you know, systemic injustice and systemic racism have been around for 400 years in this country, why did you just understand it now? They're probably not going to stick around for much longer. And so I need to make a judgment strategically. Do I want to bring in more allies? Do I want to create a broader circle of solidarity? Or I just want to piss on someone else for not knowing what I myself maybe only learned very recently? So allyship's a verb, very important for us to understand that. The second thing to being an ally and really acting in solidarity with marginalized people is the language that you use matters. Right. What I mean by that is this. Sometimes when we describe social phenomena, sometimes we use overwrought language that tends to drive people away because it seems so over the top. This is what we do. And we've all done this, where we sort of, you know, anyone that's our political adversary or ideological adversary, we have to like compare them to Hitler. We have to compare them to Nazis. We have to compare everything we don't like to the enslavement of Black people. So we got folks running around saying, you know, they're having to wear this damn mask during COVID. That's like slavery. No, it's not. And it's not like a concentration camp. And it's not like the Nazis. And it's not like Jim Crow. And it's not segregation. It's not Japanese internment. It's not indigenous genocide, right? So we use that language that sort of exaggerates a problem and everybody rolls their eyes and we all talk about how absurd it is. Sometimes, though, we also use language that minimizes a problem, right? Sometimes we use, and we don't do it on purpose. We do it very inadvertently. I don't think we give it any thought at all. But the language that we use sometimes can actually minimize the problem that we're trying to address as allies. So let me give you a few examples of what I mean. Many years ago, I was a community organizer in and around public housing communities in New Orleans, where I lived for about 10 years. And during that time, working in those communities, you know, you would hear people talking about the folks in those communities. Now, some, of course, talked about the people in those communities in very judgmental, overly hostile ways that were both racist and economically classist, because these were poor communities and they were overwhelmingly Black communities. But I'm not talking about them for a minute. I'm going to put those people to the side because I'm going to assume that none of y'all are on this call with that attitude. None of the people on this event, in this event, watching this, are the kind of people who probably, you know, condemn folks who happen to live in low-income communities and blame them for their condition. I'm assuming we're beyond that in this event. But I'm talking about the language that good, caring, compassionate people would use to describe the folks that I was working with in those communities. I'm talking about the language that service providers, everything from social workers to doctors and nurses to educators and teachers to therapists and counselors to, you know, United Way, nonprofit organizations, whatever. The language that the quote unquote good people, the quote unquote caring people, the quote unquote compassionate people, and I'm not saying quote unquote because I don't think they're caring or compassionate, don't get me wrong, but the language that they use sometimes to describe those communities was every bit as distressing and problematic as the language that the hostile people were using. What was that language? Well, think about the terms we use for folks who are struggling in this society. We use terms like underprivileged, underserved, underrepresented. I want you to think about that. And that's not hostile. Those words aren't hostile, right? No one who wants to bash poor people says, oh, those underprivileged people. Like, that's not a word hateful people use. They use a lot worse. Those are words that caring, compassionate, politicians and service providers use. But what's the problem with that language? And why does it get in the way of allyship? Well, think about it. What is underprivileged? What is that? I mean, my third grade teacher explained to me, and I'm sure at some point explained to you as well around that same grade, right? That never use the passive voice when the active voice will do, right? The passive voice minimizes the situation. Let's say underprivileged doesn't imply that anybody did anything to anybody, right? Doesn't imply that there was any action that took place that resulted in marginality and marginalization. It's just there's privilege and I'll be damned, there's you. How'd that happen? I don't know. That's bizarre. Isn't it weird that there's privilege and you're under it? I don't know what happened. Underserved, same thing. There's service, you. Service, you. Underrepresented, there's representation, there's you. What's going on, right? Nobody ever asked that question. We just sort of take it for granted that people end up where they end up like it's a coincidence. And yet we know better, right? The people who are on the bottom of our social, political, and economic structures didn't just wake up and find themselves there. It's not like sunspots. It's not lunar tides. It's not like, oh, we flipped a coin and y'all lost. Like that's not that, right? Active measures, policies, practices, procedures, a history of unequal opportunity brought us to that place. So when you say underprivileged, underserved, underrepresented, you can think of other examples, right? You're using passive language that minimizes the active component of injustice. It's very hard to be an ally when you're using language that minimizes the problem that you're trying to solve as an ally or help solve as an ally. The other problem with that language, and it's every bit as important as the passivity of it, is that those terms are relational terms, but we rarely engage the other side of the equation. What do I mean by that? Well, underprivileged is a relative word. That's just basic grammar because the word under is always and every time relative to something. What? It's relative to over. But the word overprivileged isn't even a word, y'all. Like it's not even in the dictionary, I don't think. I mean, overserved, that's not, I mean, you can say it, but it's not like right there. You type that on Microsoft Word, I'm pretty sure that little red line is going to pop up that says, yeah, you're just making stuff up. Like that's not even real, right? Overprivileged, overserved, overrepresented, those things have to exist, but we don't use that language. So why not? Why are we willing to talk about who's down and not talk about who's up? Oh, well, I think we know, right? Because if we talk about who's up, that might be us. And it is us. At some point, we're all up, right? There's nobody I've ever met that all of their social identities are marginalized. Like, even if you're marginalized around race, you could be elevated on sex or gender or sexuality or gender identity or economics or physical able-bodiedness or, having a college degree or whatever, right? Like we all have got certain categories where we're the up and we don't want to talk about the up. We want to talk about where we got hurt, right? But if we're going to be allies to a group that's marginalized and individuals who've been marginalized, we got to deal with the up piece. So if we use language that doesn't even engage that, if we just say, I'm helping the underprivileged because I'm an ally, or I'm helping the underserved, or I'm working with the underrepresented, well, how are you going to do that if you're not challenging the reality of overprivilege, of overrepresentation, of overservice? Because if somebody's not getting their share of service and their share of representation and their share of privilege and opportunity, what do we think is happening to the surplus? Like, is it just getting buried in the backyard? Like, are we just like letting that sit there? Like, oh, look at all that extra privilege. I don't know what we should do with that. I don't know, burn it. No, like somebody gets that, right? Like doesn't go to this person, it goes over here. So we need to use language that expresses the broader social dynamic of active injustice and relational systems of power. Some people have less, some people have more. We need to be willing to talk about why that is and how that came to be. Another example of passive problematic language. A lot of times folks who were, working with marginalized communities or individuals will use terms. And again, these are teachers, these are social workers, these are, folks doing good work who have a really good heart and all the best intentions. They'll say things like, well, we're working with at-risk youth and at-risk families. What is that? What is it? What does that mean? If I say this is at-risk youth, well, what are they at risk from? And why don't we just name it, right? Why do we just say at risk? Like there's this risk. It's just like floating. You're at it. Like it's coming for you. Like, well, what? Could y'all tell me what's coming for me? Because I need to sort of know what it is. Well, don't worry about it. You're just at risk. I mean, do you understand the problem of it? Like if what you're at risk from is racism, then let's say that. If what you're at risk from is impoverishment, again, not poverty, because that's passive, impoverishment, a system that has marginalized some as it has elevated others, let's say that. If you're at risk from rape culture and misogyny, let's say that. If you're at risk from transphobia, straight supremacy, say that. If you're at risk from anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, whatever it is, call it out instead of using this language that mystifies the thing that we're actually working on, right? This passivity does not serve the cause of justice, and it doesn't serve the cause of allyship. The third thing, and this is a hard one, is I find this one hard, right? And I work on it every day. And sometimes, man, I just fail. Like this is going back to point number one, that we all make mistakes. We have to strive in our goals of being allies in whatever cause. We have to strive to be hard on systems and soft on people. Hard on systems and soft on people. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is sometimes, and this goes back to that first point I was making about how when we discover injustice, sometimes we get real hard on people and we come down on them for not knowing what we know. The biggest problem with that, and the reason that I want to specify this as a unique subpoint here about being hard on systems and soft on people, is that even when people say and do really foul things, which we've all done and said, you live long enough, you're going to say and do some foul stuff and you're going to hurt someone, right? May not be around this subject, but you're going to do something that's hurtful and painful to somebody. And the question is, do we understand that hurtful, painful thing as being something that's just unique to that individual, they're just flawed and damaged? Or do we understand that as having a systemic root, right? Do we understand that these problems like racism and sexism and classism and all of these isms, that these are systems? They're not just personal issues. We're not just talking about individual level biases. We're talking about systems. You don't end up with inequality as profound as we have in this country, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about gender, whether we're talking about economics, a system of inequality like what we have. You don't get that just because of individual prejudiced people who decide to hurt other people. You get that because of the systems that you've inherited over time. And here we are in 2022, having inherited hundreds of years of inequality. And I know there are a lot of folks right now trying to keep young people from hearing about this in K-12 schools by getting rid of certain literature and getting rid of certain textbooks and saying, oh, we can't talk about the history of systemic racism, and we're not allowed to say that racism was embedded in the country from the beginning. But that's not even an arguable statement, y'all. Like rational people don't argue that. Racism was embedded in this country from the beginning. That's not an opinion. That's not like, oh, well, you're entitled to your opinion, but I'm entitled to mine. No, you're not entitled to say that that's wrong. I mean, you can say it, but you sound like a fool. It's like, well, I'm entitled to say the moon is made of cheese. Well, I mean, you could say that, but nobody should take you seriously or confer with you about anything ever again. Like, racism was baked in to this country's history. The founders, the very first thing that the first Congress did after the Constitution was ratified was pass a thing called the Naturalization Act of 1790. And what did it say? It said that all free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens. So when we say white supremacy was there at the beginning and baked in, that's not like critical race theory saying that. That's not me or a bunch of radicals. That's like the founders like, yep, that's what we did. That's what we're all about. Just so y'all know, first order of business, we got stuff to do. And the first thing we're going to do is make sure everybody knows who this here, new country was for. And it's for us and not y'all. So it's not really arguable that it's been baked in, but here's the thing. Here we are in 2022. We're not to blame for that. We inherited that, right? And so I can be hard on someone for having prejudicial views and for not really seeing the full humanity and citizenship of Black and brown peoples and seeing them as equals. I can get on them for that. And, I should. But I got to always remember that, where do you learn that from? Where do you learn that certain people are lesser than? Where were you taught that? This system taught you that. Our whole history teaches us that. Our history teaches us, right, that everybody's had equal opportunity. That's what we're told. Now, the history actually is very different, but we're taught that. That's our ideology. Our ideology says in America, anybody can make it if they just work hard. Well, the founders told you that only certain people could even be citizens. So it's fascinating that we believe that. But that's what we were told, the myth of rugged individualism, right? Well, if I'm taught that, and we were all taught that, white folks were taught that, black folks were taught that, brown folks were taught that, immigrants that just came here being taught that as soon as they come, right? I mean, that's the American mythology of rugged individualism. Well, if I teach you that as part of the American belief system, and then you look around and you see certain people up here and certain people down here, and the ones at the bottom tend to look a certain way disproportionately, and the ones at the top tend to look another way disproportionately, what do you think folks are going to conclude? Like, what would a rational person conclude if they've been told that wherever you end up is all about your own effort? You're going to go, well, gosh, I guess these people up here, they're just smarter, right? They just work harder. They're just brighter than the rest. And the people down here in some way are inferior. So you see how racism starts to actually make a weird kind of sense if you're not questioning the system, right? If you accept the system as fair and just, then you will blame the folks on the bottom of the hierarchies for being there. So I can be mad at individuals for having racist views and sexist views and looking down on poor folks, including poor white folks. I can get on you for that. And I shouldn't let it slide if you make a racist or classist or sexist comment. But I always, if I really want to be an ally, I got to go back to the source of where you learned that, right? Of where you got that impression, right? Because we have inherited the legacy of all these things, the inertia of that history, right? Today, there was a piece in The Atlantic. There's a guy who is a writer who has a newsletter at The Atlantic magazine, and he's a prominent conservative. He happens to live not too far from where I live here in Nashville, Tennessee. And he had a really interesting article today. He has a lot of interesting thoughts actually about race. I disagree with this guy on lots of stuff. I mean, obviously, because I'm not a conservative, as you can probably guess. But this guy, David French, has said a lot of really interesting things, particularly during the last several years, about why and how we need to confront our legacy of racism in this country. And today he had a piece where he was talking about this issue of systems. And I want to mention to you what he said. There was, probably have heard in the last couple of days, there's been a lawsuit filed against the National Football League by Brian Flores, who's a former head coach at Miami. He is alleging, and now other coaches are coming in, black coaches are saying that there's this sort of pattern of discrimination within the National Football League, that they're not really being considered seriously for head coaching jobs, that they're being interviewed, but then the decisions have already been made, before they even interview them. And so it's all window dressing. And we'll see how this thing plays out in the courts. I have a long history of interactions on race with the NFL. I actually was involved as an expert consultant 30 years ago on a case. So I know that there's fire here where the smoke is coming from, but we'll see how it plays out in court. But one of the things that David French mentioned in his piece, well, I thought was very important. He said that, and I'll quote him directly. He says, one of the most troubling realities of American life can be summed up in a single sentence. Systems and structures designed by racists for racist reasons are often maintained by non-racists for non-racist reasons. And he was talking about the National Football League, basically making the argument that we have a system which has a history of deliberate racism, including in professional sports. No question, right, that historically the NFL and other professional sports leagues very deliberately excluded anyone who wasn't white from those top tier positions of coaches and general managers and even quarterbacks for many, many years. That's part of the history there. And this happened in other sports leagues too. But the point that French is making is that even if we get to a point where those overtly, intentionally bigoted people are not in the front office, even if there's no overtly racist folks making hiring decisions, whether it's in the NFL or whether it's in some corporate, bank or whatever it is, that the inequalities that were created for racist reasons can live on, even when non-racist or not overtly racist people are in charge. And he goes on to explain in the piece that in the NFL case, what's going on, you look at the lawsuit, it's very obvious that these mostly white guys making these hiring decisions, they're hiring their buddies, they're hiring family members, they're hiring people that they've been connected to through this sort of old boys network, right? Which isn't necessarily deliberately racist. It's not necessarily, it's not like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain going, oh man, how can we really screw over these Black folks this week. It's just, oh, Jim, I know Jim. Let's hire Jim. Jim coached with me at the so-and-so place 10 years ago, and he coached with me in college, and he was my defensive coordinator when I coached over there, blah, blah, blah. So we end up recycling a lot of the same guys, even if there's no overt racism. But what happens is inequality gets maintained. So to be a real ally, I can't just be looking for the bigot, right? I can't just be looking for the overt racist who I can point to and say, you're the guy that, didn't hire that Black person. You're the person that said no Black people need to apply. You're the one who's the racist. I've got to be looking at the way that networking and connections and all of these informal structures operate and continue to exclude people from opportunities, and not just in a professional sports league, but in everyday jobs as well, right? If we're going to undo systems, we have to make the system the common enemy rather than making each other the common enemy. And one last thing before I'm done, it's the fourth point about allyship. If you're going to be an ally long-term, you're going to stay in that work for a longer period of time, which is what you have to do if you're going to make it a verb. You have to make real connection to the people in the communities that you're hoping to ally with and to act in solidarity with. The politics is not enough. One of the things that concerned me during the uprising in the summer of 2020 was that we had all these people coming into consciousness around systemic racism, all these white folks coming into consciousness, just like we had a lot of men coming into consciousness when the Me Too movement jumped off a couple of years before that, right? Just like we've had people coming into consciousness around straight supremacy and transphobia, and that is fantastic. But when you come into consciousness sort of late to the game and you come to it through your politics, so all of a sudden you define yourself as progressive, you define yourself as anti-racist, you have this politic, maybe you take a class in college, maybe you read a bunch of books. I got all these books behind me. I'd love to tell you that I've read all these. That'd be a lie. I have not. But if you come to your anti-racism, if you come to your anti-sexism, if you come to your allyship through politics, it's real easy for that to be transient. It's really easy for that to sort of peter out over time and fall apart. Whereas if you come to it through real personal connection to the communities that you're working with, that lasts. The reason that I do anti-racism work and the reason that I am the person in the world that I am, it's not because of the classes I took. It's not because of the books I read. It's because of the people I knew. And not only in those communities in New Orleans, but growing up here in Nashville. The reason that I speak out against racism as much as anything is because when I was 11 years old, I played on a baseball team where I was one of only 3 kids on the team that wasn't Black. And we went out to a outlying town just about 25 minutes outside of Nashville to play a scrimmage game. And the team wouldn't play against us because they didn't want to play against a Black team. This wasn't 1950, y'all. This was 1980. And as we were leaving, because they wouldn't play us, the players surrounded us with baseball bats and threatened to attack us. And they were threatening to attack our car, and their coaches did nothing, right? That's what makes me want to be an ally and act in solidarity. It's that connection. It's seeing the fear on the faces of the people that I cared for, my teammates, and my own fear, because they were being called the N-word and I was being called an N-word lover. So I'd been placed on the other side of the white humanity that was outside that car. My solidarity comes from that sense of shared purpose and shared commitment, right? The stuff you read is the stuff you read, but the stuff you see never leaves you. This is the way that I put it, and I apologize for the language in advance, but the shit you know is the shit you know, right? And when you see things with your own eyes and you feel them with your own heart, that is when you will stay in the struggle. That is when you will make allyship a verb. That is when it becomes something that you never give up on just because it's exhausting, because it will be exhausting and you will get burned out and you will suffer defeat and you will suffer setback. Many years ago when I was in college, I was an activist in the anti-apartheid movement when South Africa was still a white-ruled apartheid system. And we were doing anti-apartheid work at Tulane in New Orleans to get them to divest from companies that were still invested in apartheid South Africa. And as we were doing this work, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who recently passed, Nobel Prize winner in 1984, Archbishop of Cape Town during that time, wrote us a really nice letter to those of us who were student activists. He knew we were frustrated. We had not succeeded. We were trying to be allies to the Black folk in South Africa, and we weren't getting the kind of traction that we wanted at our school. And I think he sensed that. And he sent us a letter. He was aware of our work. He sent us a letter and he said, you don't do the things you do because other people are necessarily going to join you in the doing of them. or because they will ultimately prove successful. You do the things you do because the things that you're doing are right. And if you have that as your guidepost, you can be an ally, you can act in solidarity permanently, you can make allyship a verb, and you can fundamentally change the structures of this country. Thank you all so very much for having me. It has been an honor and a pleasure. I hope we can do it again. I hope the next time we can do it in person, but this has been a blast as well. I hope this has actually been transmitting. I could have been disconnected for half of this and I wouldn't even know, but it has been an honor to be with y'all. Thank you very much. And I hope the rest of your day goes great.